everyone. Thank you for being with us for this conference, this discussion on biodiversity. That won't be easy to answer to that issue. How can we bridge the worlds of living things? Thank you for being so numerous. Biodiversity is the living fabric of our world and universe. We'll take stock of this situation. We'll talk about the state of play with Pierre, who's going to be with me. We'll have the opinion of the Cercle des Économistes on this subject. We have Olivier Ragnat, Cécile BÉLIOT, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the BEL Group, and Omnia and Mohammed, SOUAL, Chief Economist from the OCP Group. FONTAGNÉ, we would say it. It's time to take stock of this biodiversity. We need to have figures as well, because we know that this degradation is assessed, is quantified, and we need to take stock, a real stock of the situation. Yes, thank you, Audrey, for this introduction. I will try not to overwhelm you with figures, because in truth, we read very different figures, so you make me lie already. Yeah, I told you that I was someone breathing havoc. So figures are very much different from one another, departing on the starting point, depending on the baseline. What was the biodiversity at moment A or B, then the figures would be different. I'm going to give you some ideas about the trends, the patterns, the underlying problems that underpin this trend, and I will give you food for thought, because it's not easy. Everybody has in mind, and it's recalled in the program, what this word means: biodiversity, which is a contraction of biology and diversity. What is important is diversity for economists, because it's a central word, and for a modern economy, diversity of living organisms, of ecosystems. But the viewpoint of economists on diversity is that it's a source of wealth in a lot of areas. For instance, ethnic diversity, we often forget it. Diversity of gender, that's also a source of wealth. And an economist you all know, Paul Krugman, also had half of his Nobel Prize because he introduced the idea of diversity as a source of wealth, and the other half of his Nobel Prize came from introducing geography in economists. They did actually take over with the geographers. I don't know if geographers would actually agree with me, but they said that variety and diversity are a source of wealth for consumption, for services, for components, suppliers, for companies. We can actually sketch out a model of this, and this is central to the economy nowadays. So let's go back to our diversity, namely biotopes. That concerns the diversity of environments, that concerns diversity of species within these environments, and then ultimately it concerns the diversity of individuals within each species, human species being one among others. This biodiversity is a warrant of productivity in agriculture, for the preservation of the food chain. That's also a reservoir for genetic know-how, for medicine, and that will help also for the adjustment of the cryosphere to climate change if things don't go too badly. Unfortunately, and this is where the bad news starts, we are testimony of a collapse of biodiversity, and I'm really highlighting that word. That's having massive artificialization of soils, pollution, and change of biodiversity. And also, someone will be surprised, it also comes from international trade when it's not well controlled and mastered. Some components are well mastered with control on phytosanitary products and so on, but there's also a lot of dimensions that are not well controlled in international trade, and that would entail to a loss of biodiversity. So you wanted figures. The figures that is 1 million species out of 6 will disappear tomorrow. That's already a done deal. 1 in 8 million. And half a million additional species will disappear altogether on top of the rest. So out of the 8 millions, actually, it's already a done deal. And I'm not going to talk about this because it's not my field. It seems that we are going to undergo the 6th mass extinction trend. We can count on civil society, we can count on NGOs, we can count on companies, but we are about to witness and to undergo a real disaster. And this is why it's so important. It's a matter of lack of collective action. Nothing can happen, nothing can be decided if we do not have a global agreement, because each benefits from the action of the others, but it is costly for each and every one. So why would I actually act if the collectivity doesn't benefit from it? So that means, should I buy a ticket to get into the bus? That's actually a collective benefit as well. And an aggravating factor, it's also a problem of intergenerational problem. If we lose biodiversity, we should work for our children, grandchildren. And it's very difficult to look ahead and talk about economic models when it's a matter of having an impact for the future generations to come. So the way in which the economists approach it, if they think that, it would be actually a good thing to look at a report, the report that was drafted by Sir Descriptor in the United Kingdom, whom everybody know. It's a report that was commissioned by the British government. And what this shows, Boris Johnson said that it was a good report. So I don't know if it's good news or not. Well, it seems that he took the time to read it. It's very dense. It's 600 pages. I would recommend it to you. This report, Boris Johnson said it was a good report, and it says that the value of nature should be integrated into economic calculation and calculus. When we talk about GDP, we often say we're going to do 1%, 2% of GDP. The calculation of GDP in the way in which it is done actually has a wrong assumption to start. I have still 2 minutes, so I will stick to my time. Anyway, so we haven't given a value, a price, to the destruction of a natural resource. So we give a price to what we produce, but we don't put a price to what we destroy. And so the end result is fake. It's erroneous. It's a mistake when we make calculations like this, and we're trying to talk about the green PIP and so on. But we need to rethink the business model, when we need to measure how we increase wealth, because by doing so, we actually destroy natural wealth. And there's a lot of Parisians in this area, even though we are far from Paris. What is the value of the forest of Fontainebleau? Can you give a price to the Fontainebleau forest, for instance? That's a question that economists raised and addressed. And there's a lot of criteria. We could calculate the expenditure that the Parisians would incur in terms of fuel to go to the forest, all the hours they spend driving to the forest. That has an economic price. And if we add it all up with an updating value, then we could give a cost or price to the forest of Fontainebleau. It has, if we destroy it, however, it has a negative value, a negative cost that we should take into consideration. I'm going to give you 2 examples to show you that it's altogether very straightforward and very complicated. This forest of Fontainebleau is put in the report. Well, it's not per se, they do not speak about Fontainebleau, but they said, how about destroying a forest to create a supermarket? You would get into the GNP, you would get the price of the supermarket, but you wouldn't take into consideration the cost of destroying that specific forest. And going beyond this report, and that will be my conclusion, I will give you an example which is quite similar, but that doesn't have any obvious answer. Let's assume, and I'm thinking about our friends from Berlin, what if you destroy a forest to build a factory of electric cars that would allow you to curb climate change? Is it a good idea to destroy that forest or not? Or rather say it to some politicians from the Green Party there that have some ideas on that subject. So the economic calculation about destroying natural resources, it has a price. And we are at a loss here. Economists are at a loss, but they still talk about it. Indeed, that gives us venues for thought. We already have the impact about human health. You were talking about generation, about intergenerational principles. This is with you in Omnia. We talked about health during, we are at the very heart of the subject. That's the interdependence of human health and biodiversity and health consequences that it can entail, and the commitment of young generations for this biodiversity.
Hear me? Yes. Bonjour. I'm very sorry to be speaking in English, but I hope you can understand. So thank you so much. And I'm here to talk more about biodiversity and how it impacts people. We know that the reality that we are living in right now is a combination of climate change, biodiversity loss, and toxic pollution. And this is what we call as the triple planetary crisis. As it was mentioned, we are at a crash course towards a big disaster. And we know that in 2015 in Paris, we had the Paris Agreement, and we were looking towards a 1.5 degrees increase. Now, in 2023, we are at 1.45. And what does that mean for biodiversity, and what does that mean for human health? Biodiversity affects human health through a diversity of ways, both our physical health, but also our mental health. When it comes to physical health, we know biodiversity loss is linked to malnutrition that we are seeing right now. Just in 2021, over 120 million more people are suffering from hunger, malnutrition, and acute food insecurity. And this is particularly affecting children and young people, which has detrimental impacts on their growing brain and their body. But also when it comes to the diseases that are linked to biodiversity loss and environmental degradation, 80% of these diseases lead to the mortality, to the death, and the morbidity of children under the age of 5. So you can see the intergenerational injustice that is linked to biodiversity and children's health. We can also see that because of biodiversity loss, because of human activities that lead to biodiversity loss, whether it is deforestation, whether it is unsustainable agricultural practices and the crops that are being used but they are damaging the environment that is being used, this brings more zoonotic diseases and pathogens closer to humans. And this is why we see a big spillover of zoonotic diseases and pandemics that we have never seen before. And this is because of the degradation of biodiversity, and more zoonotic diseases, but also more infectious diseases are increasing across all the world. And not only biodiversity loss, but also heat. And we are experiencing it right now, and we are experiencing it more than ever before. And when heat increases, it increases the rate of vectors that are transmitting the diseases. And this is why we can see more outbreaks of infectious diseases. In France, we saw dengue last summer, and more of these diseases are occurring and affecting the most vulnerable populations who are closer to these pathogens and to these vectors. One important thing I wanted to talk about, very directly linked to biodiversity, is mental health. And we know that especially in children and young people, we are hearing more people talking about climate anxiety, which is feeling distress, worried about the existential nature of climate change, of biodiversity loss. A study that was done last year by Google around number of people who are searching climate anxiety, and they compared the first 11 months of 2023 compared to 2017. The search queries around climate anxiety increased 27 times, and that's only overall, but in Portuguese it increased 80 times. And when children in 10 countries, 10,000 young people were asked about, are they worried about climate change? 80% of them said yes, and 45% said that this worry is affecting them from doing their daily activities. I have 2 minutes, and I have to talk about solutions of what we can do to both protect our health and the health of biodiversity, which we depend on. 80% of biodiversity is protected by indigenous communities, and these communities know how to protect it, but what they need is they need to be provided with better food, better healthcare services, and to be included in these discussions that we are having. Nobody talks about communities, and not only should we talk about them, should we empower them to lead their own solutions, should we provide them with better healthcare, better food for farmers in particular, but also for communities that are protecting the land. They need to be in these rooms where we are having these discussions about biodiversity. We have to engage them, learn from them. They have to work with economists and other policy and political leaders. We have to teach policymakers how to work better with communities, how to work with young people, and we have to do that in a way that is meaningful, that respects their time, the value, and the work that they do. I was the first ever youth envoy to a climate negotiation process, which was the biggest UN climate conference. It was the first time that a space was reoriented to include the voices of people who are most affected. And we need to do more of that reorientation, that radical listening of solutions that work for people before we invest and promote that. Thank you.
Merci. Véritablement, le contexte doit...
That's the context. That means that we shouldn't put this issue in the back burner, this matter of biodiversity, of degradation. We are going to see what companies can do, the corporate world. This can have an impact on biodiversity. It's also an actor of solutions. Bell, you're the representative of Bell Group. You are an agri-food business company, and you think that it's an important element in the chain in favor of biodiversity? Yes. I'm used to saying that a company is the sum of conversations based on which decisions are made. It's all about being human and having discussions. And often when we talk about diversity, it seems that humans are out of the equation, but biodiversity is not at the service of humans. We think it is, but it's not. We should see ourselves as part of this biodiversity. We're partners. It was very well explained. We need this biodiversity to feed, to get food. I'm part of the agri-food business. I tend to say that when we work in agri-food business, we're not talking about any kind of product. Food is not any kind of commodity. It's a human right. That's fundamental. So when we take it from that angle, then it gives us responsibility. We own have a huge liability as a component of the chain. And when we see what's going on right now with the impact on food chain, on biodiversity, but we should talk about a tripod: climate, water, and biodiversity. The good news is that when we work in agri-food business, where instead of having worlds pitted against each other, we can actually merge and bring pathways between worlds. We can work on soil, we can change models and patterns, we can change intensive agriculture that entailed loss of biodiversity, that would exhaust the soils that do not capture carbon, when actually soil's main role is to capture and to sequester carbon. So when we start from the soil, we have an answer that is very consistent, very logical between climate, water, and biodiversity. So we do not pit them against one another. We take the three at once all together. We embrace them together. And when we talk about food chain, we have the capacity to work on the three of them at once. That's interesting what you were saying regarding the economy. you know, the economic point of view, because in a company that's a sum of conversations. So as a business leader, my only job is to say, okay, which framework am I going to sketch out for this kind of discussion? And the framework in a company would define performance, basically. I create value. I'm not an NGO, I create value. The real matter is, what do we put behind the word value? What do we mean by that? And our deep conviction is that value is not defined by a P&L result. The true profit of the company should integrate all these external components in positive, but also in negative, from a positive and negative point of view. When you were talking about the cost of the Fontainebleau forest, we can say it has a cost, because I'm talking about the costs, and all the costs would actually give out a value. It's a pretty straightforward process, and it's debatable. So my opinion is that what interests me is how should we redefine value? Because we're here to win, to look for this performance, to make earnings. We don't talk about financial. We have no CFO with BÉLIOT. We're not playing on words. Otherwise, nobody would understand, neither in-house or outside. We have created a position that is the Director of Global Impact, because what he or she steers, is a global impact. So we have one leg that is sustainability, and the other one is financial return. Carbon is easy. We have tons, and we know that we're going to take 150 euros a ton. And in 1 year, we're going to say that it's 175, because this is how we would value carbon. For water, we manage to measure it. We can debate on the value, but we know that dramatically we're going to lack water in the future. Biodiversity, what is complicated for a company, is that the value is more difficult to define. We're looking for ways to define it. And KPIs, how can we measure this impact? It's easy to measure carbon. Water, it's easy as well. But biodiversity is another kettle of fish. It doesn't mean that we're not working on it. We're working with WWF and the Agro-Paritech Charter, the accounting one, so as to try to find a value for this biodiversity. And actions are well known, once again, when we're talking about regenerative agriculture. Regenerating agriculture restores biodiversity inside the soils. It gives a role to the worm. The soil has less carbon, they need less entrance, less chemical products to make crop grow, whatever feeds the humans. And it's harder to measure, but it's not because it's difficult that we shouldn't look into it. It's not because we don't have it that we can't start with something. We have started already. And to follow up on what you said on the importance of this food chain and what is at stake at the beginning of the food chain, the reason for which today agro-food business do not transform themselves quickly enough is because we have made the world more poorer to feed the world. We need to make sure that the farmers have a decent salary. Otherwise, they can't transform themselves. Once we do that, we've done it. We've started with France. 18 months after they had changed their practices, they were changing. They had GMO-free food. They're working with their proteinic autonomy. It's difficult. We have to look for profit. We have to look for this impact on return, not only return on investment, but return on impact. That's important, and actions are here. We need to implement them. Actions are concrete. They are also large-scale actions. Sometimes we wonder if we're not talking about micro-solutions. Should we talk about sourcing? Could we talk about outsourcing in Europe? What about the collapse of agricultural return and productivity? We all have these issues to talk about when we want to upscale things. Well, regenerative agriculture is also an agriculture where we know that we can implement it in France and work on productivity. We've done it with 800 farms in France. We are rolling out worldwide. We already have pilot projects. In 3 years. We'll have 100% of sourcing with regenerating agriculture in the US. The hurdle today is that we accept to pay more. We go back to the vision, to what you said about the generation, the next generation. We are family business, so the only obsession that of my shareholders is the next generation. So when we think about our children, our grandchildren, then we accept to invest, because I don't accept that it is a cost. It will be valued in my P&L ultimately, and it gives me a competitive edge because I have a long-term vision. I invest in this because when you are going to give the upper hand to ones that feed you, that you guarantee a decent salary to them, I can tell you they will manage to scale up and to integrate what we need to have a soil that would play its role to the full and that will welcome biodiversity, to capture water and to capture carbon. Thank you, Cécile Delio. There's always this matter of timelines, and that the fact that the clock is ticking. You're head of OCP on phosphates, so we're going to take stock of the situation on the use of phosphates, and especially this zoom on the biodiversity issues in Africa, something that is quite remarkable, unlike as we said earlier, that's a degradation that has really been ramping up recently. Thank you, Mrs. MAUBERT. Hello, everyone. I'm starting from the observations of Mr. FONTAGNÉ, which are very interesting. First, on figures, I agree with you. On the controversies, however, as far as Africa is concerned, I tried to cross-reference data and figures from different sources. So there are figures that are not in doubt in any way on this loss of biodiversity. And Mrs. Krogman, I really like what you said about this, about biodiversity. I agree with what you've said, Mr. FONTAGNÉ. However, to give you a snapshot of Africa today, well, it's 20% of emerged Earth today. It's 30 million of square kilometers. And unfortunately, I asked the technicians to show a map. It was not possible technically, but Africa, we can put in Africa all of Europe, or Western Central Europe, the US, China, India, and many other territories in this continent. There's only 1 billion inhabitants. That's 1/3 of the world inhabitants. But population growth will be important in the years to come on this continent. Africa is 1/6 of the world forest coverage area. That means 1/6 of the green lung of the planet. Africa is also 60% of cropland that can be used for food safety, for world's food safety purposes. So we can see how much is at stake in this continent. Regarding biodiversity more precisely, this continent, as I said, is the second green lung of the Earth, and the forest of the Congo watershed itself, on its own, covers 8% of the world's biodiversity. So we have 3.6 million of square kilometers scattered in 6 countries: Cameroon, Congo, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, And Omnia, in Africa, it's more than 50,000 species, like plants and mammals, 2,500 bird species, 1,000 amphibians, even reptile species, and 350 humid areas in 8 human humids, are actually 8 of which are hotspots. It's very critical out of the 34 in the world.
Wetlands cover about 130,000 hectares, mainly the different mangroves, etc. And the continent contains some of the biggest rivers in the world. The Nile in Egypt, and everyone knows the history of that country. There is no Egypt without the Nile. The Congo River, the Niger River, and the Zambezi River, without talking about those major lakes, which are the sources of many other rivers. So demographic growth, yes, I'll talk about that later on. And the extension of human habitats are provoking the deterioration of natural habitats and spreading out agricultural land to the detriment of the forests. And in the forests, it's the best place to sequestrate carbon. There's over-exploitation of fish by big factories, sailing factories, the big fishing, industrial fishing vessels. And there's a lot of illicit trading. And that all weighs very heavily on biodiversity. And I echo what Mr. FONTAGNÉ was saying about the 1 million species that are going to disappear, and many of those disappearances will be in Africa. So this list of the impacts on the cost and the price to be paid, well, where are the exit gates then? Where's the way forward for Africa? Well, I'd like to add 2 further things. Africa accounts to 40% of mine reserve in the world. We've talked about phosphate, so there's a huge percentage of that. 70% of the world's resources are in Morocco, so it's so important for world security. So phosphates, as we know, are organic. And what we need to do is to guarantee that we have the right dose at the right time in the right soil, and we also have to take care of carbon sequestration. If you think back to the 15th COP in Paris, we were talking about 4 per 1,000 of CO2, and that would prevent the temperature rising by that half temperature that is weighing heavily above us. So let's talk about solutions now. In terms of world food security for all living things, for plants, for example, as you know, Monsieur FONTAGNÉ was talking about those medicinal plants. Over half of them are in Africa. They have not yet been fully explored. We're talking about a very, very rich continent whose inhabitants are very poor. So that's rather striking, is it not? I was talking earlier on about mining resources, over 40%, and some ores are at higher levels, diamonds, for example, practically half of all the world resources. And for some precious metals, such as everything we need to make batteries, for wind turbines, all of that is in Africa, mainly in Africa, not only in Africa, but without talking about the rare earths. But the wealth it doesn't remain in Africa. It goes elsewhere. We've got these transfer prices. A lot of it is illegal, using different tax measures which are not detrimental to the companies, but they are detrimental to the countries, the populations. We've got this problem of water as well. As you know, there's a lot of water in Africa. However, only 4% of land is irrigated. Africa could feed the world. However, it is importing for $30 billion worth of stuff so that it can feed its own people. Today, I believe that the entire world needs to be concerned about rebalancing this equation in Africa. I think Rio, in a major work, a major book written about the African economy in 2004, well, he mentioned $1,500 billion, which would be necessary between now and 2030 to cope with the deterioration of the soil in Africa. At COP Paris, we're talking about 100 billion to adapt to climate change. Okay, so we've thrown some figures out there now. Let's save some time to address other questions which might come from the audience. So we've taken stock of the situation, the importance of water and carbon. Lionel Fontagné, let's try and start drawing some conclusions here, if we could, after this first exchange there, and then afterwards we'll hand the floor to each panel member. Well, my first conclusion is that Mohammed SOUAL has just illustrated what I've been saying. Economists have been indexing geography. They've given us a great geography lesson. And I believe that what has transpired from our discussion here is that all of the problems that we're up against, problems is a bit of a weak word, they're catastrophes really, they're all linked to climate change, to the problem of water, biodiversity. Climate change is destroying biodiversity, it's creating problems with water, and when because there's less biodiversity, we need more fertilizers, we need to use more phosphate, and we are exhausting the earth. It's an infernal circle. And I would like to give you one figure from the report I was mentioning earlier on. If we continue as we're doing right now, if we do continue like this, to keep our current level of life and so that the economy doesn't crumble, we would need an entire planet which is 1.6 times bigger than the one we have. So we'll have to go off and look elsewhere for that extra half a planet, because should we going to move to Mars? Well, it could be a bit tricky to do that, but we are going to have to include in our economic calculations, in the decisions that are taken in society, in how we organize our institutions, we're going to have to start including again the word finite. We don't like this word, but resources are finite. We're in a finite world. Energies, people have a T-shirt with printed on it, we only have one planet, which is of course the truth. We've got one planet only, and we're taking too much away from it. We're going to have to change the way we act. And if we don't do that, things will be terrible. I would like to applaud microeconomic initiatives which are taken. They're very, very valuable. They're showing the way. But we are really going to have to be more macroeconomic, more global in our approach, and find bodies that can solve these problems. The good news is what you've just said. Youngsters are aware of this. You mentioned that when you were mentioning medical issues, for example. So the youngsters are aware of the situation. We have to allow the youngsters to come in and join the debate. Give them a stronger voice there. I've also heard you talking about indigenous peoples. It's perhaps less pertinent to France, but it is very relevant to the Americas and probably also to Africa, Australia too. And so we can learn from indigenous peoples. From the beginning of time, they have created perfect nature, and we do nothing less than rush in and spoil it all. So we can learn from the indigenous peoples. We really need to think carefully about the path we want progress to take, because progress is not always heading in the right direction. Thank you very much. We are going to use the remaining 15 minutes to invite questions from the floor. Kindly use a microphone if you wish to ask a question. Thank you. If we understand correctly, you are saying that to protect the ground and biodiversity in Africa, you need 1,500 billions. If around a planetary scale, you multiply that by 2 or 3, we're talking about 5,000 billion. Is this right? That's twice as much as we spent on weaponry. So I'm not going to ask how on earth we're going to fund all that. I'm just going to leave that to the men of state. But the questions that I have for the economists here is, what is the share of research and development, for example, in farming? There is very little agronomical research carried out in order to enhance yields, whereas farming accounts for almost half or 40% of global warming. So have we assessed on a European scale or a regional or a world scale, have we assessed what needs to be done, how to do it, to enhance that? So R&D could be used to the advantage of the climate, etc. Another question, so what are we doing at school? You are doing this with businesses, but what are we doing in schools? We teach children how to swim, how to go life-saving in the swimming pool. But what can we do with the school children? How can we help these younger generations? How can we get them used to the situation? If they don't start to have these reflexes at 5 or 6, then it's already too late. So yes, you have to write books, you have to make films. There's such a lot of scope for things to be done. So what a business is doing, I'm sure Veolia, that's what they do. And I am absolutely convinced there are many, many things that companies can do. Well, I think you'd all three like to answer that question. There's many levels to that question. Well, thank you very much for this question, a major question. When we're talking about the 5,000 billion that we've just calculated there, the figure doesn't come from me. It comes from economists who are very, very competent and very respectful. Mr. Fontagné, you know them, I'm sure. And it's all been corroborated by the AFD and the French Development Agency. So today, let's take Apple, the company. Do you know how much it's worth? 3,000 billion. Nvidia, how much do you think that's worth? A little bit more than Apple. We're talking dollars here. Just take a look at all of that money, which is around. I think someone said this morning, Philippe Avion, perhaps, who was saying that today, he and Marco Netta, they were saying that European savings, in the absence of a global market here in Europe, all your money's going to the States and it's invested in American companies. The money does exist. So are we aware that we're all living on the same planet? Listen to this. I'm not going to be commenting events that are taking place tomorrow in France. However, we've got 1 billion of Africans who are going to rock up here in the next few years. So that is going to be half of the youngsters on the planet in a couple of years' time will be in Africa. So if you are expecting a tidal wave of climate refugees, then that's what we're going to see. That's what's going to happen. This is not threat. I'm not threatening anybody, and I'm certainly not adopting the political discourse of any party. However, this is a real challenge. Then in 2013, you can take a look at this. The Economic Commission of Africa, part of the African Union, put some figures on 80 billion. That will be the money that's leaving Africa every year, either illegally or because of transfer prices. So if we had world governance or an international law, you could counter that. So that's an answer to the first part. Yes, next, you're right, R&D is absolutely fundamental. And not everybody realizes this. However, we are a company which has set up a university. We're now starting to be visible. It's the Mohammed VI, the Polytechnic north of Marrakesh. So we've set up that university, and we're working on this, on carbon sequestration, on fertilizers that can be used in the soil without deterioration, without damaging it, water that can be used, as we heard earlier on. We consume a lot of water. 50%, we've consumed 50% of industrial water in Morocco. All of this water comes from non-conventional sources. These are water treatment stations that are found in the cities where we have our factories, and also we remove the salt from seawater. By 2030, all of our energy will be low carbon, 100%. We've already got 4 giga. I'm sorry to butt in here, but I've got to halt you in your flow there because we've got to include everybody. It was a big question and everyone needs to have an opportunity to answer because, yes, there are many solutions. I'd like to talk a little bit about education and how essential education is in biodiversity and commitment to biodiversity.
Top point, the point around education. So in 2021, over 60 ministers of education committed to integrating climate change into school curriculum across the world, that it would be mandatory for all school children. And this inspired me when I was a medical student to look into the education of medical students who are going to be the future doctors that will respond to the impacts of climate change on their patients. So we did that in Egypt, but we did not only do it for medical faculties, but we did across all the faculties in my university. So integrating climate change in the university student education, and we discovered that many countries did the same. This year is going to be the first ever climate camp for teachers to teach them about climate change so that they can teach their students about climate change in their own schools as well as in universities. What we're doing right now, I'm based in the UK in London, and we are working with teachers not only to integrate climate change in schools, because you teach children about climate change, but you need to also help them cope emotionally with the distress of learning about the climate crisis. So we're working with teachers around the world to not only integrate climate change, but also mental health and coping mechanisms for school children to learn about climate change. I personally worked with many children around the world when Egypt was hosting the climate conference, and we had many children delegation. And this year there was the first ever dialogue in the UN to discuss the impacts of climate change on children, and how can education play an important role in building their capacity, their agency, to do their own climate solutions, but also to choose to work in climate careers. So instead of working for a fossil fuel company, they would work in renewable energy sector, work in restoration, work in biodiversity, lead their own nature-based and biodiversity solutions that will both help the health of their generation, but also biodiversity health.
Merci. Est-ce qu'il y avait d'autres questions? Je vous en prie.
Bonjour, Marine Bro, j'ai eu l'honneur de...
Hello. I have had the honor of working with many specialists on the national biodiversity strategies, and I would like to come back to the question about the tragedy of horizons. You were saying earlier on that biodiversity requires investments for future generations, and I'm not 100% in agreement with what you said, because biodiversity regenerates quickly enough to be of benefit to current generations. However, I'd like to give you a bit of an anecdote here. I had explained to a financial expert that 50% of international GDP was based on services delivered free by nature, and those services today are being deteriorated and are crumbling. Most businesses today are blind to the services on which they depend and the status of those services. And so the investments of that financial person are at risk, and he wasn't aware of it. And he replied, he said, is it going to crumble in 3 years? He said, well, that doesn't bother me then. It's no concern of mine. So how on earth can we get beyond this tragedy of horizons? And to come back to the very first speaker, do you think it's necessary to put a price on nature to actually manage that job? This is amazing. She was reading what was in my mind. This is exactly what I was going to be talking about. So this is a question about microeconomic calculations. So for carbon, we thought about that in depth. We've seen how we can put a price on carbon. Although today what we do not know how to do is to say whether the price of carbon is the same in Africa, in Asia, and in Europe, or if, as in the United States, we should make it different. So that is a big question. So how do you change the calculation for the different businesses? So I'm an economist, and I tend to think that if we put a price on carbon, it will be really easy because it objectivizes this element. And if you've got a price which is equal to the negative impact that it generates, then you've already moved forward greatly in the calculation I referred to earlier. Now I'd like to come back to what you're saying also, i.e. we don't know how to put a price on biodiversity, and that harks back to my stupid example of the forest there. So how can you effectively measure the services that are rendered by nature? Because that's what we're talking about. There are different methodologies in economics. There's that methodology which I mentioned. There are others to measure how much you can pay the different economic protagonists. There's another one, an organization in Paris carried out some work to identify how much the European resident would pay not to have antibiotics in their shrimps. So be careful what you order at the restaurant this evening. But if you have a shrimp cocktail or you have paella with shrimps in it, those shrimps have been grown, in inverted commas, in Thailand with lots of antibiotics. They've been fed antibiotics, high doses thereof, because the antibiotics are very at high concentrations in the different ponds. So here we've got a real problem. I would mention honey as another case in hand. It's a similar example. When you buy honey, and you have your tea with a teaspoon of honey in it, if there are any doctors in the room, they know very well that you're not being cured because of the tea or the honey that you're taking in the tea. It's because of the antibiotics that are in the honey. So I'd like to finish on a serious note. There are some serious laws in Europe. They're called the SPS. The health and phytosanitary rules. They are highly criticized in Europe because we tend to say that health, human health and plant health and invasions of different species is all very important. We've got very strict rules and regulations and lots of barriers in Europe. So many cargoes are returned back to the country of origin. I'm not going to say which these countries of origin are, but the cargo is sent back there because they do not respect the rules and regulations. So we do have rules in place, and that is an incentive. If a country sees their cargo boat going back to them with their cargo boat still full, then they will change and perhaps have a more healthy attitude towards beekeeping, for example. But prices do have a role to play, this is for sure. Any economist will tell you that. But the thing is, how do you calculate the price? Does the price have to be the same for countries where their actualization rates are different because some countries want to fuel consumption more quickly than others? And the countries have different responsibilities, historically speaking. And here we go back to the Paris Agreement that you mentioned. There are some countries that have contributed more to the destruction of biodiversity, and they contributed more to carbon emissions. So should those countries pay a higher price for biodiversity than those who have been less have caused less loss of biodiversity. So we're talking about one economy, but we have to address this by one body, a global body, and that's where it's difficult. We need to get cooperation. We need to tie these different parts together, and we have to wrap up there, otherwise we will be told off. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening and being here.